Hello, all you folks out there in YouTube land. After the recording of Arthur's video, which I'm sad to say I wasn't up for the one line Kage had for me, I got to thinking about him, and his story. I've known him for better than 10 years now, and when I stopped and thought about it, I really didn't know much of anything about his life before. I'd heard all the usual high school stories, and some from his time in the military. Of the time between his discharge to the day I met him, I knew almost nothing. I catch him ruminating occasionally about how things might have been, or thinking about the son he never really got to know. That's all changed. Before I begin, I want to offer a couple of apologies. First to you, the viewer, as I'm going to have to use the synth for this, and it simply can't express the horror, sadness and rage I'm feeling as I write this. I want to find her, grab her by the throat, and squeeze until her head explodes like an overripe melon. But I cannot. That's just adding to the problem. The way through most issues is to talk about it, and at this point I need to do something before my shriveled little raisin of a heart breaks in half. I have rarely seen anyone, male or female, young or old, so shattered as he was during that conversation. He's been my helping hand when I had naught else, and I feel like this is something that simply cannot be allowed to pass quietly into the night. To you, Kage, I give my sincerest apologies for the content of this video. You can hate me for it if you really want to, but I've never shied away from your criticisms, nor you mine. 10 years ago, I was a very young woman, with no idea what to do with myself. You encouraged me and helped me find a path that suited me, and not the fucked up intentions of my family. But then, this isn't about me, is it? It's about you, and the horrors you endured. From you, it'd sound like whining. Coming from me, maybe some of it will get through a few of the thicker skulls out there. As for everyone else, I know this isn't my story. It is his. Large patches of which I was able to corroborate from the list of people I prized out of him before I went into the other room to start prepping. A few of them came up with some other names, and I was able to contact several others. I'm not going to disclose any of their identities, because protecting them means that I can offer some measure of protection for the people I care about, Kage and his family. I did my homework, and so I feel safe for the most part that the story is not being reported the way Jackie's was. Because a woman that would do such demented things need to be stacked away until we can figure out what it was that prompted such behavior, and then a trip to the dock atop that. Preferably with significant time in an appropriate correctional facility for afters. Alright then. I've been beating around the bush far too long. If I'm to stab the man in the back, I might as well do the job and not be squirrely about it. The story starts a bit more than 20 years ago. Kage wasn't aware of that wretched woman at the time, and was in fact preparing for a wedding to an entirely different young lady. A few days before what would have been a happy occasion for not only them, but their 2 daughters, he narrowly avoided death in the form of vehicular homicide. The man behind the wheel of the vehicle was drunk in a way that I can't even begin to imagine. More than 3 times the legal limit in that state. I don't know what that asshole was thinking at the time, but he somehow managed to plow through a picture window, to the permanent detriment of Kage's fiancée and the children. Kage was told that even had he been there and somehow survived, that nothing could have been done. The individual behind the wheel was well connected, and managed to secure his own release in short order, whereupon he vanished from sight without charges filed. Kage wasn't nearly so fortunate. That young lady's father, who didn't approve of him to begin with, cleaned out his home while the psychologists kept him in seclusion on suicide watch. Within a couple of months, his employer and the authorities had buried as much as they could, and sent him away. Shattered and directionless. When he got back home, things didn't get any better. Many of the people he'd known before he'd left told him the same things that he'd no doubt be told today. Buck up, be a man, and shake it off. Not the end of the world, after all, right? Those who didn't either didn't believe that such a thing could have happened, or remained silent, hoping that it would just go away on its own. But it didn't. 2 weeks later, along comes another woman, who told him that he was worth something, that his experiences were the most horrible thing that could ever happen, and provided sympathy in a time and place where that sort of attitude was rare in anyone, let alone a woman. Within a few months after that, she told him she was pregnant, and as was expected, he married her. Now at this point, by his own admission, he had made two major mistakes. First, he accepted her at face value, followed immediately thereafter by believing her claim of pregnancy without any form of supporting evidence. That's when the world came crashing down. Within the year, he'd not only been hospitalized twice for beatings received at her hands, but he spent both of those hospital stays with an unfriendly policeman guarding the door. Not to keep people out, but to keep him in. When in both cases they discovered that she hadn't been injured in any way, they released him. Right back into the same situation. By now, he wasn't sure that anyone even cared whether he was alive or dead. She had convinced him that he was a worm, completely unworthy of her, but because she loved him, she'd keep trying to help him become the man he should be. By the time he'd been back to the hospital for the 6th time in 3 years with major injuries, the police simply called for an ambulance and walked away. He was constantly underfed, at some points getting perhaps 1 or maybe 2 meals a week. It finally got to the point where he almost liked being in hospital, if only because food turned up thrice daily, and the nurses stayed around to make sure he ate, rather than that creature doing it for him. They also tried to encourage him to get away from her, but he felt he had nothing without her. He was wrong, but somehow he simply couldn't see it that way. By that time, she really had managed to get pregnant, and when the time came for him to meet his first son, she took the boy from him, and informed him that his services would no longer be required. It took a threat from the hospital staff about a call for children's services to get her to back down, and once released from the hospital, she ground the substance she knew would be lethal into the one meal he'd had a chance at in more than a week. One of the people I interviewed was at that dinner, and although the stuff in question was just fine for everyone else, the severe allergic reaction she'd been hoping for wasn't to be. He left that night, and she spent the next year until their divorce was final moving from place to place in order to keep him away from his son. In some ways he was lucky. Some friends from earlier had seen what was going on, and helped him get back on his feet, if only barely. It would be years more until he came to grips with the deaths that made her scheme even possible, and years more until he could trust anyone enough to let them see the burdens he carried. I first ran into him whilst on vacation here in the United States, and he seemed the very model of the sort of man that I'd been trained from the cradle to want. It was a science fiction convention. I will admit, I was there hunting. Yes. Shoot me now. I was a complete idiot as a young lady. I soon learned better though. He had a wonderfully plush imagination, and was speaking to a group of people about some of the fiction he'd written. Complete worlds, even universes that I couldn't possibly have conceived. He scanned over the crowd, and picked out a few of us. He asked for our names, and a little about who we thought we were as people. He didn't want to know where we were from, just what we thought about ourselves. In as few words as possible. I fumbled through mine, short, top-heavy, determined and lonely. From that alone he wove a tale of a young troubleshooter, cold to the world at large, but ready to fight with everything she had to see justice done. The others selected that day will be familiar to you. Tabby, Destiny, and my would-be chaperone Arthur were all there. Tylin, Sayuri, Jack, Miria and the others would all turn up later on. I tried that evening, I really did. But he made it clear that what I wanted wasn't going to happen. Not why. I finally dragged that out of him just this afternoon. I was welcome to remain in contact, though, and if I wanted to, I could read the rest of the stories that he'd written. Yes, I was disappointed, but knowing what I do now, he was right to set me down as gently as he could muster. I know me, and I wouldn't have understood. I went home, and we managed to stay in touch. He told me nothing about the time between his leaving home the first time and the day I met him, except to point back to the stories he'd written at the time. At his urging, I went on to university, first in my native England, and then here. I challenged myself to learn what it was that made stories that were obviously fiction seem as real as they do. I took classes in astronomy, geology, math and physics alongside art and English. I still can't write with the skill he seems to have, but I did work out what the secret was. If you're interested, then bug him to read a few of his stories on the channel. Speaking strictly personally, I enjoy them thoroughly, and I think you all might too. Now I don't have this on any authority, but I firmly believe that writing those stories is what kept him going through all of the torment. I know he dabbled a bit in high school, and still more during his military time. Just the thought of the volume of work done after he finally got clear of that thing makes my hands cramp. Alright then. I've done the dirty feminist thing and made the story about me, haven't I? I should really learn not to do that. That said, I think my experiences with him, and eventually his family, are at least somewhat relevant. He had every reason to be cold, callous and hurtful. But that's not who he is, or who he wants to be. To be that sort of man would be to let that beastly spoiled bitch win. Yes, as a group we've taken up the flag against feminism. For that, there are no apologies to be had, nor quarter to be given. Underlying all of that mess is a clear message from society. Don't complain. No matter what happened, it's your fault. By accident of conception, you are the lowest form of life to have ever existed, and you will bloody pay for it, with your life, if we think it necessary. I say bollocks to that. Are we as a species so cold, so shallow as to make the men in our lives disposable? Where the death of a person isn't just the end of their existence, but instead a feminist issue? It seems like everywhere I look, there's a feminist rabbiting on about patriarchy, and how all women are victims. I refuse to play the victim when so many real victims are shamed by you stupid little girls into silence, because they're possessed of penises. As women, we expect men to coddle and protect us, to demean themselves to save us the slightest bit of discomfort, or even lay down their lives at every opportunity we might present. Modern feminism talks about male privilege, but what does that really mean? You don't know, do you? Can you even define the term in a single sentence? We have privilege. Lots of it. We have the privilege to stay home while the boys are expected to go and fight. We get things free of charge from men we don't even know, and often wouldn't even talk to in any other setting. We have the privilege of sex whenever we want it, as long as we're not inclined to be picky. We have complete control over our reproductive systems. If we don't want a child now, we have 100 ways to prevent it, or failing that, several ways to end the pregnancy. We can enslave men for 20 years or more by the simple act of not doing those things. More often than not, we're held blameless by our leaders and our communities if something bad happens. When we are held accountable, then the time we spend paying for it will often be much less than theirs. We even have special legal defenses that can remove culpability for some of the most heinous crimes. Do you remember battered wife syndrome? That is an affirmative defense that can and is regularly employed if a woman kills or maims her male partner. There may be cases of the opposite, but I've never heard of one. In the West, we have nearly complete bodily autonomy. Anyone caught with a cutting instrument anywhere near our vulva or any other part of that bit of our anatomy is going to jail for a long, long time. For infant boys, it's considered routine to chop off the skin at the end of their tiny little knobs. In some places, including this one, it's considered elective surgery, and as such must be paid for by the parents. I could go on about this for hours, but I think I'll save that for another video. It's a topic that warrants a bit more time than I want to spend on it right now. In other places, the parents have to scream loudly that they don't want it done, and even then it might still happen. There was a story in the news not that long ago about a lawsuit in which the father of the boy wanted the procedure, and the mother not. The decision was just recently handed down by the family courts, in favor of the father. Except the child is now 4 years old, and the procedure carries far more risk for him than it would have at 4 days old. Even at that tender age, the consequences of even the tiniest error on the part of the person performing the procedure are horrifying. Kage will get into the details of that particular issue in a special video. If I'm allowed anywhere near him after this, I'll put a bug in his ear. Feminism is spreading a message of hate all across the planet. The only people that seem immune to the message thus far are under Muslim control, and they are the ones that could do with a healthy dose of second-wave feminism. Starting with a version of the Declaration of Sentiments in Arabic is probably a bad idea. Back on track a bit here. As I was listening to Kage's description of his behavior all those years ago, I thought it seemed eerily familiar. After I finished my other research, it finally hit me. That's the same behavior I'd seen from my father towards my mum, and in a much larger group, feminist allies. We like to refer to them as white knights, but their actions suggest the same level of guilt and shame that imprisons many people, men and women both, in potentially deadly relationships. That same sort of rhetoric, similar sorts of societal pressures, and an overwhelming urge to fix what's broken in ourselves, rather than recognize that the other side might be part of the problem. It's almost like religion, or the guilt and suffering you can stack on, plus another couple of tons for good measure. I often hear about how all children are born dirty sinners, and that the only path to salvation is to pledge yourself to some amorphous concept that no one can even really define. There are millions of ways to get there, but only one of them is the absolute right one. Problem is, they all claim to be that right one, and there's no objective meter to stick with which to determine which one won't land you in eternal torture for being a right shitlord. I don't need feminism. Feminism needs me, and I'm not available. Without the individual feminist, the creature as a whole becomes weaker, in the same way that the current panic from Christians about their moral majority is playing out. As science expands the frontiers and pushes the place that God is even can exist into the tiniest of nooks and crannies, atheism is on the rise. People breaking away, first one, then a few, then hundreds or thousands. Now there is a virtual deluge of people hanging up their Bibles in favor of their favorite sort of science text. The churches lose adherents, and thus money, and slowly starve to death. Only the cults of personality maintain any strength where science is trod. Feminism has its share of superstars as well. Anita Sarkeesian, Gail Dimes, Andrea Dworkin, Gloria Steinem, Chanty Binks and more take up their flags and join the likes of Ken Ham, Alex Jones, Kent Hovind, Fred Phelps and Chet Haggard in spreading their toxic sludge around our fragile blue world. The silence must stop. If we do not speak for those that come after, then who will? It will be fundamentalists, religious and secular alike. If it's not Christianity, it will be feminism. If it's not the conspiracy theorists, it will be Islam. Because today, they've come for you. Speak out, gentlemen, because no one else will. Your silence is their shield, the same shield the radical feminists use to spread their bullshit. That same shield that defended religion for untold millennia. To break the wall, we must make ourselves heard. It took a small number of men and a couple of women to make the first crack in the bulwark that is religion, and the feminists are still building theirs. If you want to be free to be who you really are, then this is a battle that is worth fighting. No, that's wrong. This is a battle that must be fought. Everyone on this channel, Kage, Destiny, Tabby, Tylin, Arthur, Jack, Sayuri, Miria, Ashley, Charlotte and I stand with you.